Jake Whitman adjusted the worn collar of his leather jacket as he stepped through the polished glass doors of Whitman Co. Jeweller's flagship location. The faint chime of the silver bell above him rang out across the opulent showroom, but not a single head turned to greet him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. To everyone else, he was just another middle-aged man in faded jeans and an old coat looking for something special. No one suspected he was the founder and CEO of the multi-million-dollar jewelry empire they worked for. His face was shadowed with a few days' worth of stubble, and his neatly combed hair had been tousled to look slightly unkempt. He had spent years building this brand into a global name, but today he wasn't here to be the boss. He was here to be invisible. He slowly wandered past gleaming glass cases, housing rows of diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, each piece lit to perfection beneath ornate chandeliers. The air was perfumed with a blend of leather polish and glass cleaner, the smell of luxury and precision. It had been nearly 2 years since Jake had last visited this particular location, unannounced, and a lot had changed since then. He noticed the staff bustling with rehearsed energy sales associates, assisting couples, adjusting lighting and checking inventory tablets with practiced ease. Everything looked flawless on the surface, but Jake had learned the hard way that perfection often hides the truth. That was why he was here, not for appearances, but for insight. Settling into a corner of the store, he waited near the entrance to the exclusive showroom vault, a plush leather chair supporting his weight as he pulled out his phone pretending to check emails. In reality, he was watching a private security feed through an encrypted app, one that only he and the director of security had access to. It was one of many tools he had at his disposal, and he used it to evaluate the store's real-time protocol integrity. Cameras tracked every movement above, and 2 guards stood stationed at opposite ends of the room. Professional alert, but never intrusive. He scanned the floor carefully, watching the employees. So far, nothing felt off, but Jake's instincts had been sharpened by decades in business, and those instincts were whispering to him now. Just then, a polished young man in a navy blazer approached with a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you find something special today?" the man asked. Jake cleared his throat and adjusted his tone slightly. He didn't want to sound like the man who had closed deals in Tokyo or addressed the press in Manhattan. "Actually," he replied casually, "I saw a salon sapphire ring on your website. It had a diamond halo. I think it was part of the signature collection." The associate's eyes lit up. "Ah, yes, sir, an excellent choice. One of our finest. Would you mind waiting a moment while I retrieve it from the vault?" Jake nodded. "Take your time," he said with a faint smile. This wasn't just a random selection. Jake had chosen this particular ring for a reason. It was a high-value item that required a visit to the inner vault, which meant he could discreetly test the security protocols he had recently invested millions to upgrade. As the associate disappeared through a side door, Jake leaned back and checked the time. Everything seemed to be moving according to plan. He watched on his app as the employee went through the proper steps: fingerprint scan, access card, rotating digital code. All systems responded perfectly, but still something gnawed at Jake. Maybe it was the quiet tension in the air, or maybe it was the way light filtered through the room, catching specks of dust like clues. He knew this store like the back of his hand. He had overseen the design, selected the layout, and personally approved the lighting system. Every corner, every code, every schedule, Jake had them memorized. Yet despite all the predictability, he felt uneasy. There had been too many recent changes, too many layers added between him and the day-to-day operations. He wasn't here just to test security or service. He was here to reclaim something intangible, the pulse of the business, the truth behind the sparkle. As he waited, pretending to be just another customer with an interest in gemstones, Jake Whitman prepared himself to listen more closely than ever before. As Jake waited in the plush leather chair near the front of the showroom, he casually pulled out his phone again. To a passerby, it looked like he was scrolling through emails or checking messages, maybe coordinating a gift purchase with a spouse. In reality, his fingers were navigating through a secure application known only to his inner circle. The interface gave him real-time access to internal security feeds, door access logs, sensor data, and movement tracking from the store's newly upgraded surveillance system. He had insisted on the redesign after a series of minor incidents in other branches, nothing stolen but just enough to justify a proactive overhaul. This store, his flagship location, had been the final one to receive the update, and now he was here to see if every dollar had been well spent. The system's display unfolded like a control room in miniature. Jake could see Marcus, the associate, who'd gone to retrieve the sapphire ring, moving through the three-stage vault access protocol fingerprint scan, encrypted keycard, and rotating PIN code, all of which had been verified without issue. The hallway sensors lit green with every step he took, motion confirmed. In the corner of Jake's screen, a thermal overlay showed the heat signature of the vault, which was locked down tight just as expected. Every reading was within threshold, and the cameras above the display cases rotated smoothly in their pre-programmed sweeps. On paper, everything was functioning perfectly. And yet Jake felt that familiar tension building in his chest, the subtle itch of doubt that had warned him through boardroom betrayals, market crashes, and even one failed merger that nearly cost him his name. He shifted slightly in his seat, angling himself just enough to glance around the store without drawing attention. Two security guards stood at their stations near the exits. Their stances were professional but relaxed. Customers milled about examining pieces with varying degrees of interest, some couples clearly shopping for engagement rings, others looking more like browsers than buyers. One woman studied a display of tennis bracelets with deliberate slowness. Nothing about the showroom screamed danger or deception, but the silence felt rehearsed, too clean. The air felt dense, not with perfume or polish, but with a kind of unseen pressure. Jake's gaze returned to his screen, and he began checking the security log timestamps. His gut wasn't satisfied with surface-level perfection. He tapped into the recent activity records, reviewing door entries, exit logs, and motion triggers. The last security shift had changed over at exactly 12 p.m. on schedule. The next shift wouldn't arrive until 4 p.m. That left a 3-hour window where the current team operated without overlap. Nothing unusual. This was a standard procedure at most locations, but suddenly it struck him as a potential vulnerability. What if someone knew that? What if someone timed their moves during that lull when routines felt safest? Jake kept scrolling. Camera sweep cycles remained steady every 7 seconds for the main floor, every 10 for the vault corridor. He had chosen that interval himself. But what if someone else knew those intervals too? Jake narrowed his eyes. A week ago, he had received a quarterly report on employee access patterns. Julian, his senior manager, had flagged some minor anomalies at this location. At the time, they hadn't raised red flags, but now, in the thick of his own unease, Jake saw those notes in a new light. Someone had accessed the internal code database 3 times in one day, last Tuesday. The justification had been vault testing for audit compliance, on its own that would have passed without scrutiny. But now Jake was stacking those details on top of this strange stillness. Was he overthinking? Was he just being paranoid? Possibly. But paranoia, he'd learned, was a trait that had saved more of his assets than optimism ever had. He locked his phone and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees like any undecided shopper weighing a big purchase. But his thoughts were racing. Every system said, "All clear." Every visual cue whispered, "Business as usual." And still his instincts rang like an off note in a perfect symphony. Maybe it was the way one of the guards kept checking his watch. Maybe it was how quickly the sales associate had offered his business card as if rehearsed. Or maybe it was something even more subtle, an invisible shift in atmosphere that only someone like Jake, who'd built this empire from a single storefront, could sense. One thing was certain, he would not ignore that voice in his head. Jake had built Whitman Co. Jewelers on precision trust and the quiet discipline of always paying attention, especially when it seemed like there was nothing to worry about. Today was no different. Something wasn't sitting right with him, and he had no intention of brushing it aside. He might not have had proof, not yet, but experience had taught him that instincts were the earliest alarms in any system, and today they were quietly screaming behind the perfect glass cases and polite smiles. So he waited, calm, calculating, and quietly preparing to dig deeper. Jake was still seated, eyes scanning the security logs on his phone, when the silver bell above the entrance chimed again. The sound had become part of the store's signature, a gentle tone that whispered elegance rather than announced arrivals, but this time it didn't blend into the background the way it usually did. It rang differently in Jake's ears, more like a warning than a welcome. He instinctively looked up, careful not to move too quickly, or obviously 2 men had entered the store. They were dressed in suits that, while expensive, didn't quite fit, right too tight at the shoulders, too loose at the waist. Their shoes were polished, but not well worn, and neither of them made any attempt to engage with the displays or staff. They walked with purpose, but their eyes never rested on anything for long. To anyone else, they might have seemed like high-end clients doing a quiet walkthrough, but to Jake, they looked like a pair of wolves sniffing the perimeter. Both men split up slightly, but stayed within a close enough distance to exchange glances. The taller one had a noticeable bulge under his jacket just beneath the left arm, a concealed firearm. Jake noted immediately, though he kept his expression neutral. The shorter man, who walked with a tenser posture, kept casually brushing his hand across his right ear. It was the kind of movement someone might make if they were adjusting an earpiece or communicating through a hidden mic. Neither one acknowledged the security guards. Neither asked for assistance. They were scanning the room, not with interest, but with strategy. Jake lowered his gaze to his phone again, fingers idle on the screen. But his mind had switched into high alert. Every instinct he'd tried to justify earlier as overthinking now screamed invalidation. He tapped a command into the secure app and redirected one of the overhead cameras to zoom in on the taller man. The image sharpened cufflinks, slightly scuffed watch face, dark circles under his eyes. These men weren't tourists or buyers. They were professionals. But the question was, professionals at what? As Jake watched them through the corner of his eye, he adjusted his posture, leaning over, slightly pretending to search for something in his messages. He kept one hand close to the record button on his device's audio capture function. If something was going down in his store, if they were planning anything illegal or suspicious, he wanted documentation. Then it happened. The 2 men had gravitated toward the central display case, a location that gave them both visibility and relative privacy. They began to speak, just barely audible over the ambient jazz playing through the sound system. Jake strained to catch their words without moving. "Midnight's the sweet spot," the taller man muttered, his back to Jake, pretending to examine a row of diamond tennis bracelets. Security's thin cameras run the standard loop. His guy on the inside said, "No patrol overlap until 4 a.m. His companion gave a quick nod, never breaking the illusion of being a casual customer and the system. Any surprises the shorter one asked, the reply came low and cold. "Nah. Our man says it's all flash. No depth. Just like the owner, too busy playing mystery shopper to notice what's happening under his nose." Jake froze. Inside job. The phrase hit like an ice pick to the spine. It echoed in his mind as the men continued talking. He didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply, afraid to do anything that might draw attention. They had no idea he was listening, and even more so, they had no idea who he was. If this was real, and everything about their demeanor told Jake it was, then someone inside his own company was feeding them information. Someone who had access to security systems. Someone who knew the new protocols that narrowed the list of suspects down significantly. Only a handful of employees had been briefed on the new system. One of them had sold him out. The taller man continued in a whisper. "Manager says he's got access to the vault codes, alarm timing too. Says we've got 22 minutes before the secondary grid kicks in. Plenty to clean out the main vault, and that, what did he call it, special collection room." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. The special collection room held some of the rarest and most irreplaceable items in the entire brand's inventory. family heirlooms from private clients, museum-quality pieces, waiting for charity auctions and handcrafted items from designers around the world. Those weren't just jewelry. They were legacies, and someone inside was helping these men rob them blind. He clenched his phone tighter, willing himself to remain composed. He wasn't just witnessing a breach of protocol. He was watching the planning of a betrayal. Jake remained seated, appearing deep in his phone, but his mind was spinning. He had gone undercover to test systems. Now he was witnessing a conspiracy unfold in real time. The betrayal was bigger than he feared, and it wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about control, about the safety of what he had built. But what the two men didn't realize was this. They had revealed their plan to the one man who could still stop them, and Jake Whitman. No matter how calm he looked on the outside, had no intention of letting them walk out of his store. Untouched, Jake remained still, his phone in hand. The security feed dimmed to preserve battery as he leaned slightly forward in his chair, his entire body quiet but his mind boiling. He'd heard bits of their plan already, details about timing, vulnerabilities in the camera loop, but now the conversation turned darker. The two men had repositioned themselves near the far side of the showroom, close enough to avoid staff interaction, but still within speaking range of each other. The taller one, with his stiff shoulders and restless hands, glanced around once before saying it aloud. "Brandon Ellis is setting everything up, says he's got full vault access and can shut down the new security protocols before we even walk in." Jake's heart sank. He barely processed the words that followed. Brandon Ellis, his most senior manager. His right hand, Brandon, hadn't just been another name on the payroll. He had been handpicked by Jake himself nearly 6 years ago. Recruited from a competitor for his meticulous eye and unwavering loyalty, Brandon had helped train the management staff across multiple locations. He was the one who wrote the manual for internal loss prevention. He knew everything, every safe code rotation, every nightly reset sequence, every blind spot Jake had allowed to exist only because he trusted him, and now he was the mole. He said the new security system's just smoke and mirrors, the shorter man added, barely audible, real sleek on the surface, but no teeth. He's already tested bypassing the grid without triggering fail-safes. Said your man Whitman wasted his money. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the chest. He stared down at his phone as if it might provide a different answer, as if maybe he'd misheard, but the words had been too clear, too confident, and the pain they triggered was too deep to be imagination. Brandon had been to Jake's home. They'd shared late-night phone calls about business expansion and personal struggles. Brandon had stood beside him when his father passed, had raised a toast at Jake's 50th birthday dinner. And now that same man was tearing down the very legacy they had built together, brick by brick, protocol by protocol. Jake's mind flashed to the memory of a private company dinner last spring, where Brandon had stood up to speak about integrity. It was now obvious that the lie had already taken root, long before those words had left his lips. The two men continued speaking in low voices, still assuming no one was listening. "Brandon says we've got a clean window, 22 minutes from entry to exit." The tall one said, "That's all the time we need. He's already neutralized the guard rotation. The alarms will be silent. The vault's code, access will be preloaded before we even show up." Jake could barely believe what he was hearing. His fingers gripped the edge of his seat. So this wasn't opportunistic. This was methodical. This wasn't a crack in the wall. It was a tunnel, dug with care. One that started months ago. Jake had believed the updates in the system were airtight, but Brandon hadn't just studied them. He had designed the override, and he'd sold it all out to a pair of professional thieves for a share of the cut. Jake's head spun with memories, the performance reviews. The quarterly strategy meetings, Brandon's carefully worded suggestions to simplify security oversight ideas, Jake had approved without hesitation. Why wouldn't he? Brandon had earned that trust over years of loyalty, or so he thought. Now Jake saw it clearly. Every moment of trust had been a step closer to betrayal, and the cost wouldn't just be financial. The Special Collections Vault held family heirlooms entrusted by generations of clients, pieces that carried personal history and cultural value beyond any insurance policy. Jake wasn't just facing a robbery, he was facing the weaponization of trust, and it was being orchestrated by the one person who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the heart of this very store. As the two men began moving toward the exit, their recon apparently complete, Jake remained seated, his face unreadable, but inside a storm was brewing. He had built Whitman Co. Jewelers with the belief that you only succeed when you surround yourself with people you trust. That belief had now been shattered, not by strangers or competitors, but by a man who had stood beside him during the company's most pivotal moments. Brandon Ellis hadn't just turned his back on Jake, he had turned it on everything they had worked for. And now, with less than 8 hours until midnight, Jake knew he had a decision to make: respond with rage or rise with resolve, because this wouldn't be settled in a boardroom. This would be settled face to face. Jake remained seated, his posture still composed, but his mind was racing at 1,000 miles per hour. The two men were now circling back toward the main display cases, speaking more freely than before, perhaps emboldened by the quiet of the showroom and their belief that no one was paying attention. One of them laughed softly, then said, "It's all set for midnight. The moment the doors lock for the night, we go in." 22 minutes to clear both the main vault and that exclusive room with all the one-of-a-kind stuff. The casual tone with which they discussed the heist only deepened Jake's sense of dread. Midnight, that gave him less than 8 hours to stop a meticulously orchestrated theft and to catch the traitor who had once been his most trusted ally. As Jake listened, he realized this wasn't some last-minute break-in attempt. This was months in the making. Every detail had been studied, every vulnerability mapped. "Brandon's got the guard schedule handled," the shorter man muttered. "The guy working nights thinks his kid's got a basketball game 2 hours away. Won't even be in the building when we go in." Jake's hands tightened around his phone. That security guard Thomas was a father of 3. Jake had seen pictures of his family during last year's holiday party. Brandon had used that personal connection to manufacture an absence. That wasn't just betrayal, it was manipulation at the most intimate level. And if Brandon could do that to a loyal employee, what else had he altered? He also tweaked the cleaning crew's rotation. The tall one added, "Store clears out half an hour earlier than usual tonight. Insurance logs were updated too. If anything goes missing, the paperwork's already in place for a claim that won't raise flags." Jake's eyes narrowed. That explained the recent surge in policy streamlining requests. Brandon had submitted subtle changes that hadn't seemed dangerous in isolation, but now formed a chilling picture. When viewed together, Brandon wasn't just helping these men access the vault. He was erasing every trace of the crime before it even happened, a digital paper trail designed to confuse delay and cover their tracks. Jake knew if the plan succeeded, not only would irreplaceable items be gone, but he'd also have no immediate proof of how or who was responsible. And worst of all, they thought he would never notice. Whitman's probably off playing mystery shopper in Chicago or LA. The tall one sneered guys too wrapped up in expansion and press appearances to see what's right under his nose. The irony nearly made Jake choke. Here he was sitting 10 feet from them, listening to every word, and yet their assumption was understandable. For months, Jake had taken a more distant leadership role, trusting Brandon to oversee day-to-day operations while he focused on brand growth and investor meetings. He had believed that building trust in others meant granting them autonomy, but in doing so he had created the very blind spot Brandon was now exploiting. The men continued talking, laying out final touches of the plan: where they'd park the vans, how they'd bypass the biometric sensors, even which pieces to grab first from the special collections room. "Start with the tiara," one of them said. "The one from his mum's collection. Our guy says there's a buyer in Dubai already lined up. Big payday." Jake felt the breath leave his lungs. That tiara wasn't just a valuable heirloom. It had belonged to his late mother, worn on her wedding day and passed down through generations. Its loss would not only be financial, it would be emotional, personal, irreplaceable. The idea that Brandon had not only betrayed him, but sold out a symbol of his family's legacy to black market dealers filled Jake with a deep, shaking fury. But rage wouldn't solve this. He knew that what would solve it was clarity. Calm, calculated action. He had spent his life learning to master chaos, from early retail failures to global market turbulence. Jake had always found the thread of control in the mess, and now he had to do it again. The thieves thought they had mapped out every detail. They had timed the heist to the second. They had disabled the alarms, or so they believed, but what they hadn't accounted for was this one moment of overconfidence where they revealed their entire plan to the man they believed was absent. Jake Whitman wasn't gone. He wasn't distracted. He was here. He was listening, and now he was planning something of his own. Jake walked out of the store slowly, careful to keep up the appearance of just another customer, browsing expensive rings on a quiet weekday afternoon. He nodded casually to Brandon as he passed the same man who just hours from now would attempt to rob him blind. Brandon smiled with the same polished ease Jake had seen 100 times before, a mask perfected over years of trust. It was a performance, and Jake played along. Once outside, he slipped his phone from his coat pocket. Not the one linked to company systems, but a secondary line he kept for personal contacts. His hands were steady, but his pulse was erratic. He scrolled through the contacts, bypassing half a dozen familiar names until he landed on one that hadn't lit up in over 4 years: Rachel Monroe. Rachel had once been a detective with the city's Special Investigations Unit, specializing in organized crime and internal fraud. She was sharp, relentless, and utterly fearless. Years ago, she'd helped Jake uncover a string of thefts at one of his first regional locations, catching not only the thief, but exposing a supplier who had been skimming product. Since retiring, she'd opened her own private security consultancy, and while they hadn't spoken much in recent years, Jake had always told her, "If I ever get in a bind, I'll call you, not the cops." That time had come. He tapped her name and waited. She picked up on the third ring. "Jake Whitman," she said. No surprise in her voice. "It's been a while too long," Jake replied. "I need your help. Urgently. It's bad, Rachel." He didn't waste time on pleasantries. In a low, measured voice, he relayed everything he'd seen and heard. The overheard conversation, the midnight timeline. Brandon's betrayal, the inside knowledge of the vault and the special collections room. Rachel listened without interruption, but Jake could hear her chair creak as she leaned forward, fully alert. When he finished, there was a pause, then her voice came through cool and steady. "Where do you want to meet Lotus Tea House?" Jake said, naming the small, unremarkable cafe 3 blocks from the store. It had always been their neutral ground, quiet, off-grid, and forgotten. "By most 30 minutes," she replied, and the line went dead. By the time Jake arrived, Rachel was already seated at a back booth, a tablet open in front of her, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She looked up, eyes sharp as ever. "You weren't kidding," she said, as he slid into the seat across from her. "This isn't just a robbery. It's an infiltration." Jake nodded grimly. "And I can't go through the police, not yet. If Brandon catches even a hint that we know, he'll vanish and take the evidence with him." Rachel was already typing as he spoke, calling in her private security team. "I've got 4 ex-Special Forces contractors on retainer," she said. "They're fast, discreet, and don't ask questions. We'll go in as a cleaning crew tonight." Jake raised an eyebrow. "We've only got a few hours." Rachel gave him a half smile. "We've done more with less." As they spoke, she pulled up a copy of the store's blueprints, something Jake had given her years ago when she helped design an earlier version of the vault's defense system. "Look here," she pointed to a narrow section on the diagram. "This is the security core. With your permission, we'll build a parallel feed, one that reroutes every camera and motion sensor into our own network. It'll look like the system's down when Brandon makes his move, but in reality, we'll see everything." Jake nodded. "Do it." She looked up from her tablet. "Just one thing, you're not staying out of this, are you?" Jake leaned back in the booth. "This is my store, my legacy. I'll be there." Her eyes softened, but only slightly. Then we do this. Clean fast. No mistakes. By 8:30 p.m., the plan was already in motion. Rachel's team arrived in an unmarked van dressed in matching grey coveralls with ever-bright cleaning stitched into the front. The staff assumed they were a contracted deep clean crew sent by Brandon. It was the perfect cover. Over the next 40 minutes, they installed a duplicate security infrastructure, a shadow network that mirrored every camera angle, every pressure plate, and every access log. The original system would appear offline at midnight, just as Brandon intended. But this time, it would all be a lie. Rachel's team used thermal scanners, encrypted receivers, and signal masks to ensure no digital trace would lead back to them. Jake observed from the shadows, heart pounding, as he watched years of trust being quietly dismantled in the very place he had built with his own hands. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, the cleaners had vanished without a trace their work done. The showroom looked exactly as it always did. Elegant, pristine, untouched. But now every inch of it was under Rachel's control. Jake stood in the staff corridor, alone staring at the vault doors. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head, the words he used to say when Jake was young and reckless in business. "When everything feels quiet, son, that's when you listen harder." Tonight, Jake had listened, and because of that, he still had a fighting chance. He had uncovered betrayal, called in reinforcements, and rebuilt his store's defenses from the inside out. The thieves believed they were walking into an empty house. What they didn't know was that the walls were already watching them, and Jake Whitman would be waiting. The store was silent now. The lights had dimmed to after-hours mode, leaving only soft ambient glows along the jewelry cases and the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. In the heart of the store, deep behind the customer floor and beneath layers of security doors, Jake Whitman stood still inside the special collections room. Gone was the tailored suit and polished demeanor. Tonight he wore black tactical gear, snug and silent, designed for movement but weighted with purpose. His boots rested on the same carpet where so many moments of legacy had walked the very floor where priceless heirlooms had been presented, photographed and cherished. But tonight this room wasn't a sanctuary, it was a battleground. Jake crouched low behind a display pedestal that once held his mother's sapphire tiara. Night vision goggles rested on his brow. He didn't breathe too loudly. He didn't move unless absolutely necessary, because tonight the trap was set. Earlier that evening, Brandon Ellis had gone through his normal closing routine. On the surface, it was flawless. He checked off registers, waved goodnight to the remaining sales staff, even double-locked the front doors for added effect. Then, with the calm arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable, Brandon activated the alarm panel, or so it appeared. In reality, he was inputting a code designed to shut down the real system, the one he'd corrupted from the inside, and leave the store vulnerable. He lingered for just a moment, staring at the main lobby as if savoring the stillness, then left locking the outer doors with a satisfied grin. What Brandon didn't know was that his custom code had done nothing. Rachel's parallel security system was now running the show. The fake signals he thought he'd sent were being absorbed and rerouted, while every move he'd made was being time-stamped, recorded, and backed up off-site. Inside the collections room, Jake listened closely through his earpiece. Rachel's voice came through in short, clear bursts. All teams in position. Thermal confirmed on exterior. No movement inside perimeter. Switched to encrypted audio with a double tap on the comms unit strapped to his forearm. Jake confirmed. His eyes scanned the room slowly. This space had always been one of his proudest achievements, an intimate showroom designed to protect and showcase the rarest items ever entrusted to Whitman Co. He knew every corner, every pane of glass, every pressure sensor, and tonight it had become his fortress. In front of him, the collection's display cases sparkled innocently beneath soft motion-triggered lighting, but they were armed with new glass sensors installed by Rachel's team. Any contact would set off alerts, silent ones, visible only to their parallel network. Jake opened his tablet, resting it gently on a velvet pedestal. Through a private channel Rachel had routed only to him, he watched as 6 camera feeds filled the screen views of the front entrance. The rear loading dock, the sales floor, and most importantly, the vault corridor. Every angle was accounted for. Every room had eyes. Outside, Rachel monitored from the command van, parked 3 blocks away beneath a nondescript service canopy. Her voice remained calm, her words clipped with precision. 11:37 p.m., Brandon is confirmed at his apartment. Leaving now, Jake exhaled slowly. The clock had begun ticking. He turned his attention back to the vault door. It loomed in the darkness, solid, ancient and unyielding. But tonight, Brandon believed it was his to conquer. Minutes passed like molasses. Jake checked the time again, 11:50 p.m. The parallel network remained stable. Infrared sensors had begun tracking 2 inbound vehicles from opposing directions, just as Brandon's accomplices had described. Rachel reported the approach in a whisper. Targets arriving. Team 2 hold perimeter. No movement until primary breach. Jake's heart beat steadily now. Not in fear, but in discipline. The trap wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. The showroom was armed, the footage live, and every protocol had been built to allow the thieves to step into the illusion they thought they had created. But this illusion belonged to Jake now. He wasn't just reclaiming control. He was reclaiming his vision, his legacy, and the very ground they dared to violate. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the encrypted feed captured Brandon approaching the staff entrance, flanked by 2 of the same men Jake had seen earlier that day. They entered without hesitation, using the access code Brandon had manipulated into the system weeks ago. The moment they crossed the threshold, Rachel's voice came through again. "They're inside. Stay dark. Let them start." Jake didn't move. His hand hovered over the remote capture key. In front of him, the special collections room waited like a sleeping giant, and Jake, now more than ever, was ready. Ready to watch his betrayer step into the lie he believed he controlled. Ready to take back everything. The clock on Jake's wristwatch struck midnight. A silent tremor passed through the building, subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jake felt it in his bones. The digital clock mounted inside the vault corridor blinked from 11:59 to 12:00, and with it, the real game began. On the encrypted tablet screen in front of him, the camera feeds flickered briefly as the shadow network transitioned fully into active monitoring mode. Every room was now under the control of Rachel's system. Every movement, every sound, every breath would be logged and recorded in triplicate. Jake adjusted the strap of his tactical vest, heart steady. Across the secure line, Rachel's voice came through with precise timing. "Brandon has re-entered. 6 bodies total. Confirmed." Jake tapped his comms once acknowledged. He kept low, his eyes fixed on the display case that once held his mother's sapphire tiara. It was still there for now. The staff entrance door slid open on camera, and Brandon stepped inside, flanked by 2 men Jake had seen earlier and 3 others' faces unfamiliar, but movements unmistakably professional. They didn't hesitate. They moved like a unit fanning out across the showroom, each heading toward a different objective. Brandon moved with chilling confidence, his tablet in hand, already accessing the fake system he believed he controlled. Systems offline. One of the thieves said, his voice barely audible through the filtered mic feed. "Grid's dead." Brandon nodded. "Exactly as planned. You've got 22 minutes. Stick to the timeline." His voice was cold, calculated, nothing like the man who used to lead staff training sessions and give birthday speeches. Jake watched from his hidden vantage point in the special collections room, every frame of video imprinting into his memory. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had a face, a voice, and it was moving through his store like it belonged there. The team went to work. One man started disabling jewelry displays on the showroom floor, sweeping high-value pieces into velvet-lined collection pouches. Another moved toward the vault's secondary compartment, accessing it with codes Brandon supplied. But it was the third man, the one with the dark beard and narrow shoulders, who entered the special collections corridor with Brandon. Jake's breath hitched. This was it. Through his night vision goggles, he watched as the door to the collection room creaked open. The ambient lights, triggered by Brandon's override, cast a soft glow on the walls, illuminating glass cases filled with irreplaceable pieces. "Start here," Brandon said. "This row item's tagged as Heritage Line. The tiara goes first. I've already got a buyer in Dubai lined up." The man nodded and pulled out a case cutter, quickly unsealing the first display. Jake stayed perfectly still, not 10 feet away, as he watched them desecrate what he had sworn to protect. The thief gently lifted the sapphire tiara, his mother's tiara, from its pedestal. The blue stones shimmered under the soft lighting, reflecting off the glass like scattered moonlight. "You sure about this one?" the thief asked. Perhaps sensing the piece's significance, Brandon gave a short, humorless laugh. "That'll be dismantled and reset by Monday. No one will recognize it. It'll be like it never existed." Jake's fingers tightened around the remote trigger device in his palm. That tiara had been passed down through 4 generations of his family. His mother wore it on her wedding day, his grandmother before her. And now Brandon, who had toasted those stories over wine, was selling it like a pawn ticket to a faceless buyer. Through his earpiece, Rachel's voice returned. 5 minutes of continuous footage logged, cameras locked, audio synced. Keep letting them work. The thieves moved like dancers through a wicked performance, coordinated and silent. They opened cases, scanned tags, removed GPS trackers where Brandon had told them to look. Jewellery heirlooms, designer masterpieces, all placed into heavily cushioned containers for quick transport, and all of it was being captured in crystal-clear detail through the secret security grid. Secondary vaults open, another man's voice echoed from the hallway, pulling the rare gem sets now. Brandon responded without turning. "Good. Be careful with the Roman emeralds. The stonework is brittle." Jake's stomach turned. These weren't amateurs. These were professionals, guided by someone who had been taught by Jake himself. Brandon hadn't just betrayed him. He had reverse-engineered his entire system and repurposed it for a heist. But Jake didn't move. Not yet. His instincts told him what Rachel's team had confirmed. Let them go just far enough to make the case airtight. This wasn't just about catching them in the act. It was about ensuring there would be no questions, no escape, no legal loopholes. Every second they spent inside the vault sealed their fate a little tighter. Jake lowered his goggles slightly, looking at the thieves now, not through lenses or monitors, but with his own eyes. And he wasn't watching criminals. He was watching ghosts, ghosts of trust, broken, ghosts of friendships that had rotted in silence. And soon they would be history, but not yet. Not until the last lie had been told, not until Brandon Ellis reached for one more priceless item, believing he was still in control, completely unaware that Jake Whitman had already taken back everything. Jake counted the seconds in his head. 23 minutes had passed since Brandon and his crew had entered the store. The thieves had moved through the vault and showroom like professionals, efficient and silent. Their bags now loaded with nearly a lifetime's worth of legacy. But they were running out of time, and Brandon knew it. "Start loading out," he ordered. Standing in the center of the special collections room with a calculated air of command, his voice echoed slightly off the glass, filled with that same confidence Jake had once admired. The man had positioned himself like a conductor at the climax of a symphony, but the final note was not his to play. From the shadows of the room behind the pedestal, where the sapphire tiara once rested, Jake stepped forward. "You only know what I let you know," he said clearly, each word cutting through the air like glass. Every head in the room turned at once. Brandon froze mid-motion, his hand still hovering over the edge of a velvet-lined case. The other men began to reach instinctively toward their coats, where weapons were hidden, but it was already too late. Red dots from Rachel's team lit up their torsos in a silent warning. Jake stood in full view, now wearing black tactical gear and the same steady, unreadable gaze he'd perfected during years in business. "Hello, Brandon," he said. The silence that followed was deafening. "Jake," Brandon finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're supposed to be in Chicago, and you were supposed to be loyal." Jake replied, his tone turning ice cold. The thieves hesitated, unsure if they were dealing with a CEO or a soldier. Jake's presence, commanding, calm, and completely unexpected, threw off every calculation they had made. Brandon's expression shifted from shock to fear to fury. He backed away, slowly, reaching inside his jacket. "Stay back," he warned, pulling out a small rectangular device, a remote detonator. The blinking light on top pulsed like a heartbeat. "Don't test me, Jake. I will bring this whole place down." "You think I came in here without a backup plan?" Jake didn't flinch. "You wired the vault?" he asked, more curious than afraid. "Yes," Brandon snapped. "Enough to destroy this room and everything in it. The cases, the walls, the whole damn legacy you love so much. And I'll do it if I have to." Behind the glass, Rachel's voice came through Jake's earpiece, steady and controlled. "No signs of explosives detected yet, but treat it like it's real." Jake nodded subtly, his focus never leaving Brandon's face. "We're not going to do this your way," Jake said softly. "You don't want to be a destroyer. Brandon, that's not who you are." Brandon's hand shook slightly. He kept his thumb near the trigger but didn't press it. Jake took a step forward, slow and deliberate. "Do you remember the night we signed the downtown lease?" Jake asked. "You said we were going to change the way people experience jewelry, that we'd make it about meaning?" "Again? Not just diamonds and dollars," Brandon scoffed, but his jaw tightened. Jake kept going. "You told me loyalty was everything, that you'd follow this brand into the fire. I believed you. I built with you. You stood next to me at my mother's memorial. Brandon, you held the box with that very tiara in it, and now you're selling it for scrap." The room held its breath. One of the thieves shifted nervously, visibly rattled by the rising tension. Jake paused, his voice lowering just enough to feel like a whisper across glass. "You're not here because you want to destroy this. You're here because you lost faith in what we built. And I get that. I really do. I took my eyes off the floor. I trusted you too much, and you turned that into resentment. But this isn't the way. If you press that button, you lose everything. And not just me, you lose everything. Your future, your name, everything you once stood for." Brandon's arm dropped a fraction. The blinking light on the device cast a faint red hue on his trembling fingers. The fury in his eyes gave way to a flicker of something else, conflict maybe, or grief. "I gave everything to this place," he muttered, his voice cracking, "and still I was invisible." Jake took one final step forward now, just a few feet away. "Then let me see you now. Let me see the man I believed in, the one who didn't need to steal to be seen." Brandon's hand trembled violently. His thumb hovered over the button. He looked around the room at the cases he once stocked at the walls. He helped design at the men around him who would now turn on him in an instant. Then, without a word, he turned. He made it 2 steps before Rachel's team brought him down. The detonator skidded across the floor. Harmless. Jake exhaled the air, leaving his lungs like a storm finally breaking. The thieves were restrained, the recordings captured, and the legacy preserved, at least for now. But the wound ran deeper than security breaches or shattered glass. Jake had confronted not just a thief, but a former friend, and though he had won tonight, the real cost would take much longer to tally. The moment Brandon hit the floor, time seemed to shift back into motion. Rachel's team moved with military precision, sweeping in through the vault corridor and the emergency side entrances. In less than 60 seconds, all 6 thieves, including Brandon, were secured, weapons confiscated, evidence bags sealed and logged. The red laser sights that had painted their chests moments earlier vanished as silently as they had arrived. The detonator was retrieved and examined. As it turned out, it had no live connection, just a bluff. Brandon had gambled on desperation and lost. The other men didn't resist. Professional enough to know when they'd been outmaneuvered, they lowered themselves to the ground without further struggle. Only Brandon kept his head high, his eyes not meeting. Jake's sirens wailed softly in the distance as the local police arrived to take over custody. Thomas, the night shift guard who had been tricked into leaving for a fake basketball game, arrived with them fuming, betrayed and more determined than ever to testify. Jake stood to the side, breathing slowly, watching as his store transformed from a crime scene back into something closer to its true form. The special collections room was littered with velvet cases and scattered jewelry bags, but nothing had been lost. Not a single piece of his mother's tiara, not a single heirloom from the clients who had entrusted him with their stories. Still, the damage wasn't just physical, it was personal. The man who had betrayed him hadn't been a stranger. He had been family and all. But name Jake watched as Brandon was led out in handcuffs, expression blank, jaw clenched. The weight of betrayal was heavier than any gemstone. But Jake didn't let that weight consume him. He had learned long ago that in business, as in life, pain was inevitable. What mattered was what came after. Rachel stepped beside him, tablet in hand, replaying the final moments of the heist from multiple angles. We got everything she said, voice quiet but assured. Visuals, audio, synchronized timestamps, access logs, inventory snapshots. This case won't need a trial. It's airtight. Jake nodded his eyes, not leaving the main floor. Thank you, he said, for everything. She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. You built this place to last, Jake. Tonight proved it, but Jake didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Because while the thieves were gone, their access hadn't come through force. It had come through trust. And that truth lingered like smoke after a fire. He thought back to every meeting he'd missed, every report he'd skimmed every time he'd said Brandon's got it covered. Delegation without oversight, trust without verification. He had let his distance become a weakness. That realization hit harder than Brandon's betrayal, because it wasn't about one man. It was about a system Jake himself had built, a system that allowed someone like Brandon to operate unnoticed, unchallenged for months. Jake wasn't just a victim of betrayal. He was part of the structure that allowed it to happen. And that was something he couldn't ignore, not if he wanted this company, this legacy to endure. So as the police wrapped up their statements and the cleanup crew began restoring the showroom, Jake stepped into the back office and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He pulled up the company's internal dashboard and began reviewing every branch, every manager, every access point. Not out of paranoia, but out of responsibility. This time he wouldn't just delegate trust, he would earn it back from the ground up by dawn. Jake had already drafted a 5-phase internal reform plan. He outlined mandatory rotation schedules for upper management, dual authorization procedures for vault access, and a whistleblower program protected by third-party encryption. More importantly, he laid the foundation for a cultural shift, one that valued transparency, not just in finance, but in leadership. He also created a direct line of communication between floor employees and executive leadership, bypassing traditional hierarchies. If someone saw something wrong, they wouldn't need permission to speak up, and every new hire would now be required to undergo not just onboarding, but ethics orientation. Because trust wasn't just about integrity, it was about vigilance. Jake stepped back into the showroom as sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the polished floors. The store was quiet, but it wasn't broken. It had withstood a test few businesses ever face and emerged stronger. The betrayal that could have shattered his legacy had instead reinforced his purpose. Jake knew there was still work ahead, calls to clients, damage control with stakeholders, emotional repair with staff. But for now, he allowed himself a moment. One breath. One look around the space he had nearly lost. Then he straightened his back, adjusted his sleeves, and turned toward the front doors. Because leadership wasn't about walking away when things went wrong. It was about walking back in with clearer eyes and the courage to rebuild what truly matters. 1 week after the attempted heist, Whitman Co. Jewelers reopened its flagship store, not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve. The shattered trust had been swept up, analyzed, and replaced with something stronger. Jake Whitman stood in front of his team on the main showroom floor, where velvet cases had once been tampered with under the cloak of betrayal. Now those same cases held pieces of renewed purpose. Every employee from the front desk to the back vault gathered to hear what came next, Jake didn't bring a script. He brought something rarer, vulnerability. "This isn't just about what happened," he said, voice firm. "It's about who we become because of it." And with that, he unveiled a sweeping set of reforms. Structural, procedural, and cultural security was the first to change. Every vault now required dual authentication, a physical key, and a biometric scan managed by separate individuals. Each store location underwent a security audit, not by internal staff, but by third-party ethics consultants. High-value transactions triggered automatic encryption logs, stored off-site and monitored in real time. But Jake didn't stop there. He launched a company-wide retraining initiative, not just on policies, but on purpose. From now on, every new hire would attend a 3-day legacy and trust seminar, learning the emotional and historical value of the jewelry they handled. Not just carats and clarity, but the stories, the 30-year anniversaries, the final gifts before someone passed, the dreams turned into diamonds, because that Jake knew now was what truly mattered. Alongside those reforms came a shift in presence. Jake, once known for managing from a polished office 3 cities away, made a new commitment to be seen. He began rotating through every branch location across the country, working side by side with floor teams sitting in on meetings, not as a CEO, but as a colleague. His presence changed the air. Employees who had once hesitated to speak up now felt heard. His personal stories shared in town halls and newsletters weren't about profit margins, but about people. He told the tale of the necklace that had belonged to a Holocaust survivor entrusted to the store with trembling hands. He shared the history of a bracelet given by a soldier before he left for war. These weren't just products, they were pieces of soul. And in telling those stories, Jake helped his team rediscover theirs. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the consequences of Brandon's betrayal continued to unfold. His confession, once recorded and verified, led to a deeper investigation by federal agencies. The security footage and internal logs provided by Rachel's team proved invaluable. Within weeks, a series of arrests took place across 3 continents, dismantling an international jewelry trafficking ring that had operated in shadows for nearly a decade. What had started as a personal loss became a global disruption of criminal operations. Law enforcement agencies commended Whitman Co, not just for their vigilance, but for their refusal to remain silent. Jake received letters from overseas partners and clients thanking him not for stopping a crime, but for standing tall when it would have been easier to hide behind silence and shame. The media coverage was inevitable. Headlines read, "CEO stops heist from inside the vault and legacy restored. Whitman Co leads. Industry reform." But Jake deflected praise. In every interview, he redirected attention to his team. "This wasn't about me," he said again and again. "It was about people who chose to act with integrity when it mattered most." He instituted new employee awards, not just for sales, but for ethics and empathy. One of the first recipients was Thomas, the security guard, who'd been tricked into leaving his post, but who returned to testify with courage and resolve. Another was Ava, a junior associate who noticed an irregular shift log and had quietly flagged it weeks earlier. The message was clear. Heroism wasn't reserved for the top floor. It lived everywhere. 3 months later, as the company celebrated its 40th anniversary, Jake stood once again inside the special collections room. The cases had been redesigned, each now accompanied by a story plaque written by the families who had entrusted the pieces. At the center, beneath a protective dome of reinforced glass, rested the sapphire tiara, untouched, unbroken, unforgotten. Jake placed a hand gently against the case. It reflected not just his face, but the journey behind it. A journey of pain, of betrayal, but ultimately of reclamation. Reclaiming a company, reclaiming a culture, reclaiming a family's legacy. As he stepped out into the main floor where customers once again browsed and employees now walked with pride, Jake understood one final truth. Greatness isn't built by avoiding failure, it's built by rising from it, with your values intact and your people by your side. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on the power of trust and integrity, we invite you to join our community here at Deep Inside HQ. Every week we bring you powerful, true stories that reveal the heart behind everyday people and the extraordinary choices they make. Subscribe to our channel, turn on the notification bell, and be part of this journey where truth meets transformation. Your voice matters. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let's grow a world where courage, leadership, and empathy are never forgotten.